Everyone has heard of Atlantis, the amazing city that was destroyed overnight, taking all of its secrets with it. But few people know that the story of Atlantis was put in the public domain by Plato, one of the greatest thinkers of all time, and also a brilliantly creative writer who enjoyed telling instructive stories to guide humanity along the right path. To believe that Atlantis actually ever existed would be on a par with believing that the cave Plato wrote about in his famous allegory of the cave also existed, probably in Atlantis. Plato says that philosophers are those who free themselves of the cave and the shadows on the cave walls, which seem like reality but are not. Philosophers are concerned with perceiving and understanding the higher levels of reality. Ordinary people are not. Plato says that the other inmates of the cave have no desire to leave their prison and the life they know there, and might even kill anyone who said there was a more real life outside the cave. The tale of Atlantis should be understood in similar terms. Don't fall for any simplistic telling of this tale. Don't believe a single word of the so-called Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean. The question is not whether Atlantis really existed, but why Plato told this particular story. Plato, it should be emphasized, was particularly interested in building the perfect city and society, the Republic. He called the perfect city Callipolis, beautiful city. It's clear that Atlantis was a forerunner of Callipolis but suffered from some defect that the Republic would correct. Plato was from an aristocratic background and had a great physical presence, and an astonishing charisma based on his unprecedented intellect. Plato grew up in Athens during the disastrous Peloponnesian War, which saw Sparta become the dominant Greek power. In some sense, Athens itself was Atlantis, a hubristic city that met its nemesis. Was Plato secretly condemning democracy in his tale of Atlantis? Would Athens have fallen if it had been governed in Plato's desired meritocratic rather than democratic manner? Plato's Republic actually has many similarities to Sparta, the conqueror of Athens, except Plato switched the emphasis away from Spartan militarism to Athenian intellectualism, of which he was the leading light, followed by his star pupil, Aristotle, another towering genius. During the Peloponnesian War, an Athenian armada traveled to Sicily to launch an Athenian empire, but suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Sicilian city of Syracuse, where the people were led by a Spartan general. Athens seemed about to launch itself on the world stage, just as Rome was about to do, yet fell off its perch in one fateful campaign. Doesn't that echo the fate of Atlantis? It was a great city that suffered a calamity and disappeared. Was Plato secretly warning Athenians that they would suffer the same fate if they did not adopt his form of government? Plato deliberately cited Atlantis past the Pillars of Hercules, separating the Mediterranean Sea and Atlantic Ocean. He was saying that it was beyond the known world. It was well known from Homer's work that all mysterious lands were placed in the far west, beyond the known world. Homer located Paradise, the Elysian Fields, in the far west. He also put Chimeria, the land of perpetual darkness there, and also the land of dreams, and the underworld, Hades. So, as soon as you went beyond the Pillars of Hercules, you were, as every Greek understood, venturing into the unknown. In effect, Plato was making Atlantis like the Elysian Paradise, or some lesser, more human version of it. He clearly meant it to be understood as a fantastical and allegorical place, not a real, historical destination that once existed and then vanished in its entirety, not leaving a trace. Atlantis, at the edge of the world, was an advanced society, a seemingly perfect city-state, but actually facing its own imminent extinction. This raises an alternative regarding Plato's true meaning. Perhaps what he wished to convey was that a perfect state was possible and indeed had once existed and dominated the world, but then had been lost because of a natural disaster. It was no fault of its rulers. In these terms, Plato was encouraging Athenians to imagine that they could become the next Atlantis, and how would they do that? By following his blueprint for a perfect state that he had set down in his great work The Republic. He was tantalizing his audience. He was telling them that he knew the secret of the perfect state. He knew all about Atlantis, the previous perfect state, and now Athens could become the new Atlantis by following his leadership. Plato located Atlantis 9,000 years in the past, in a land beyond the known world. He was putting it beyond the reach of any historical evidence and cloaking it in myth. The tale was intended to inspire people, not to be taken seriously as real. Plato was using the skills of a poet to conjure something akin to Homer's Troy. Troy was probably a real place. An actual site has been given for it, and most historians seem happy with it. Atlantis, however, was said to exist thousands of years before Athens and even Greece historically existed. It's not as if Atlantis was mentioned in any history books, such as there were in those times. If Homer's Troy was shrouded in myth and existed just a few hundred years before Plato's time, what would a city that existed many thousands of years earlier be like? People would understand it to be utterly mythical. Atlantis, Plato said, belonged to Poseidon, god of the seas, and was ruled over by his son Atlas, king of the island, from which it got its name. The word Atlantic, as in the ocean of that name, comes from the Greek Atlantikos, meaning of Atlas. Atlas was the Titan who carried the sky on his shoulders, and the Atlantic originally referred to the Sea of Atlas. Atlantis referred to the island of Atlas. The Atlanteans were said to be a great maritime force that conquered much of Africa and Western Europe. This is all clearly mythical. If Atlantis had a great empire, then obviously the loss of Atlantis itself wouldn't mean that all of its no doubt impressive colonies in Africa and Europe would vanish too. There would be evidence of the Atlanteans everywhere, if they were real. But they weren't and were never intended to be considered real. Don't you find it odd that no one considers the fact that Atlantis was supposed to control a vast empire? If you take the Atlantean Empire seriously, then it couldn't possibly have vanished all at once, any more than the Roman Empire could have disappeared overnight. Even if Rome were destroyed by an earthquake, the rest of the empire would continue and the capital would simply be relocated. Pompeii vanished in a day, but everyone knows where it is. Its remains are still visible for all to see. Real things on a vast scale don't do a disappearing act, but mythical things do. Atlantis had a vast temple on a mountain in the middle of the island, with a marvelous fertile plain all around it. The island comprised concentric rings of land and water, connected by elegant bridges. Its people were like demigods. In fact, this seems like a description of the Elysian Fields, the Greek paradise. Wouldn't that have had the ideal government? The Atlanteans supposedly got as far as Athens, even though Athens didn't actually exist 9,000 years earlier than Plato's time. The Athenians led the fight back against the Atlantean Empire, and everything started falling apart for Atlantis and its empire. Atlantis was destroyed by earthquakes, floods and tsunamis. Atlantis sank beneath the waves, never to be seen again. Is anyone buying that? These events are clearly based on those concerning a natural disaster that befell the Minoan Empire. Wikipedia says, the Minoan eruption was a catastrophic volcanic eruption that devastated the Aegean island of Thera, also called Santorini, circa 1600 BCE. It destroyed the Minoan settlement at Akrotiri, as well as communities and agricultural areas on nearby islands and the coast of Crete, with subsequent earthquakes and paleotsunamis. With a volcanic explosivity, the eruption was one of the largest volcanic events in human history. Atlantis is a reimagining of this, set in mythical terms. Plato claimed that Solon, the grandfather of Critias, discovered the story of Atlantis in an Egyptian temple. Hieroglyphs depicted the whole tale. Which is odd given that there is actually no mention of Atlantis in ancient Egypt. Just as there is no mention of any Hebrews being enslaved in Egypt, and no mention of 10 plagues and the slaughter of the firstborn. Aristotle didn't take Plato's story seriously as history. He joked about Plato's ability to conjure nations out of thin air and then destroy them. Plato was definitely a great enough creative writer to do exactly that and pass it off extremely convincingly. Atlantis appears nowhere else in the writings of the time. It was all Plato's marvelous invention. None of Greece's brilliant historians or poets or playwrights mentioned it. And the whole story then vanished until the Renaissance, when Plato's works regained their prominence, and the magical tale of Atlantis was rediscovered. Everything you've heard about Atlantis is wrong. It's a great concoction of a genius philosopher who happened to be a brilliant creative writer and could mesmerize people with his allegories. The real point of Atlantis is that a great people can become hubristic and then be destroyed by the gods, by Nemesis. exactly as happened to the Athenians themselves in the Peloponnesian War. A truly great people, led by Plato's philosopher kings, would not offend the gods. They would be blessed by the gods. The real point of Plato's dialogues concerning Atlantis were to get people to read his brilliant book The Republic about how to properly run the state. In Plato's book, Timaeus, an Egyptian priest says, "And there you dwelt as became the children of the gods, excelling all men in virtue, and many famous actions are recorded of you." The most famous of them all was the overthrow of the island of Atlantis. This great island lay over against the Pillars of Heracles, in extent greater than Libya and Asia put together, and was the passage to other islands and to a great ocean of which the Mediterranean Sea was only the harbor. And within the Pillars the empire of Atlantis reached in Europe to Tyrrhenia and in Libya to Egypt. This mighty power was arrayed against Egypt and Hellas and all the countries bordering on the Mediterranean. Then your city did bravely, and won renown over the whole earth. For at the peril of her own existence, and when the other Hellenes had deserted her, she repelled the invader, and of her own accord gave liberty to all the nations within the Pillars. A little while afterwards there were great earthquakes and floods, and your warrior race all sank into the earth, and the great island of Atlantis also disappeared in the sea. This is the explanation of the shallows which are found in that part of the Atlantic Ocean. According to this, Atlantis was located near the Pillars of Hercules, where the waters are now shallow because Atlantis is just beneath them. We are also told that the Athenian army of the time was wiped out in the same cataclysm. No one talks about that. If no one believes that Athens was a great power 9,000 years before Plato's Athens, and as a matter of historical fact it definitely wasn't, then why would anyone believe in Atlantis? People will believe anything, it seems, especially if a genius like Plato tells them to.